all very much. So we have an exciting theme on data sciences today. I'm Partha Mukherjee from Purdue University Mechanical Engineering. And on behalf of the organizing committee, it's my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished moderator of today. And just before I do that, a brief preview for next week. Next week, our lineup of the talk and theme is on combustion. And we have speakers from Purdue and UCLA. And our distinguished moderator would be Tim Levin from Georgia Tech. And with that, let me introduce our distinguished moderator today. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Curt Bronkhorst from University of Wisconsin-Madison. Before I get into the details, I would like to say that we have a little bit of common thing. I also spent a couple of years at Los Alamos, where Professor Bronkhorst spent a very distinguished career before moving to Wisconsin. So with that, so Professor Bronkhorst is now a professor of applied mechanics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. As I mentioned, he had a long and distinguished career at Los Alamos National Laboratory, and he is credited with fundamental contribution to the development of crystal plasticity finite element model, which is now a commonly used numerical technique in understanding mechanics of metallic materials. And along his way of a long and distinguished career, if I may say it again, he has had many awards. Of course, during Los Alamos, he was awarded 2 Los Alamos Distinguished Performance Awards, Defense Program Award of Excellence, and DOE Office of Science Outstanding Mentor Award. He is currently an associate editor of the International Journal of Plasticity and ASME Journal of Engineering Materials and Technology. And he is also a fellow of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. With that, I would like to hand it over to Professor Bronkhorst. It's again, welcome everyone, and thank you, Professor Bronkhorst. I couldn't take it from here. Thank you.
Partha, thank you for such kind words. Very appreciated. Good afternoon on this Friday afternoon to everybody. I send each of you greetings from beautiful Madison. You'll see the red gym behind me, and that's sitting on Lake Mendota. So take those to heart. So we have 2 very distinguished young faculty with us today. Another very exciting day. First is Mark Fuge. He is going to speak to us first about lost in space. Design manifolds can accelerate design and optimization iterations several-fold, which is a very important theme amongst many of our sponsors and many of our scientific colleagues these days. Certainly aspects of computation and data sciences as part of that. Mark is currently an assistant professor of mechanical engineering at University of Maryland, College Park, and it looks like Mark has been there for 5 years now. So starting to think about his tenure package. And so he has a long history in a number of physical areas related to computational science and data sciences. So he's going to talk about this topic of lost in space, which we're all very eager to learn about today. So with that, Mark, we look forward to your talk.
Great. Thank you, Curt, for the wonderful introduction. Let me go ahead and share my slides here. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to hear me talk today. Today, I'm going to talk to you about this idea of design manifolds. However, to kind of connect it back to the broader audience, really what I want to talk to you today is broader than this, and it's about a fundamental problem across all of mechanical engineering that affects a variety of different areas, and that's really representation. And this is, and specifically what I mean here is mathematical representations. Mathematical representations, whether it's the design of a product or the mapping of a physical phenomenon or understanding something like uncertainty quantification, have been the underpinnings of most of the major advances in mechanical engineering, starting from work on understanding things like Emmy Noether's work on symmetry groups and the effect of things on conservation of mass, to things like quaternions and the subsequent developments in mechanics that resulted from that. So mathematical representations of how we understand designs or phenomenon of interest in general are the underpinnings of basically all of mechanical sciences. And what I want to try and motivate for you today, in the brief time that we have together, is that there's a place for what I would call data-driven learning of these mathematical representations, taking the best of what we understand about physics and mathematics and coupling that with the ability to learn these mathematical representations from data. And what I'm going to try and convince you of is that these representations are not only possible, which might be obvious, but that they're powerful in ways that you might not expect. And more broadly, to claim that they're in fact necessary, not in isolation, but as a part of any researcher's toolkit, no matter what kind of research you do, right? If you do thermodynamics, vibrations, control, design, and in my case, that they're an important tool both as a researcher and as an educator to be thinking about the future of what we want our mechanical engineering or scientists to be able, students to be able to do. And that these are necessary for tackling the most pressing societal problems that we have today, ranging from climate change to energy security to national security. So that's what I'm hoping that you'll get out of today. It's a pretty broad claim. And what I want to be able to do is show this to you in an admittedly simple example. I'm going to pick one example from the time that we have today. That's an example of a turbine blade. I really like turbine blades because I think they represent in such a small piece of equipment so many of the complexities that we see across mechanical engineering, from pushing the boundaries of material science to vibrations to manufacturing to aerodynamics. They're really a wonderful example. And I'm going to take even a simpler example than this, which is just the 2D cross-section and just the aerodynamic portion of it. But I'm hoping that from this simple example that you won't focus so much on the specific application, but rather what the broader implications of these ideas of learned representations would have to your field, right? Whether you work in this area of turbine design or whether you work on robotics or medical devices, because the kind of things we're going to talk about apply to all of those cases. And specifically, how I want to spend the next 15 minutes or so is to talk first, what are these ideas of design manifolds? That's sort of specific to the work I do, but it's these data-driven learned mathematical representations. Why are they useful, right? Why go to the trouble of trying to learn these skills necessary to be able to study these things? And then where do you go from here? If I do convince you that these are important tools to add to your toolbox, what could you do? Okay, so when I talk about a design manifold, what do I mean? So let's go back to that simple little turbine blade example, and even simpler than the full 3D one with all of its complexities, let's just look at something like a 2D cross-section of that, something that might look like this airfoil, right? And I think an important question that we often take for granted is, well, what actually is an airfoil and how do I represent it? That's a non-trivial choice. What I've shown you here is basically a set of 2D coordinates, about 50 or so of them. And so in principle, this is a 50 times 2, because each point has 2 dimensions, 100-dimensional object. Now, this is not the only thing I could have used to represent this airfoil. I could have put on a B-spline, a NURB surface. I could have chosen to represent this in freeform deformation using deformation gradients. There's all sorts of different ways that I could take something even as simple as a 2D shape of this airfoil and represented it. And therein lies the challenge, right? Because each of those choices, every time I decide to tweak that fundamental representation, it's going to change the kind of questions that I can meaningfully ask of that representation. And so when I talk about learning data-driven mathematical representations of objects, what I mean is, what are the sets of knobs or factors or mathematical objects or quantities that make sense or that help me study something like this airfoil or any other system better? Okay, and that's really what my group focuses on, is on how do we find ways of learning these low-dimensional representations for things like geometry that you see here, but for also things like material systems, graphs of system architectures. And to give you a sense of why this choice might matter for those of you who haven't maybe had to deal with this in your own work, this is actually a pretty terrible representation of an airfoil. And the reason we can kind of tell this is because if I take any one of these 100 numbers that control the shape of this thing, and I perturb it just slightly, just a tiny bit, what you actually see is a fairly, as you stand back and squint, not a big difference in in what you might see. But from a physical perspective, right, what has this done to the effects of something like a flow field going around this airfoil? Well, it's had a major effect. Right, so small minor perturbations in the representation have created large effects. If my goal is to, for example, optimize this object for a certain performance parameter, this is not maybe the best representation because it's 100 dimensions long, and small changes in any one of these in a random direction can cause major problems. And so one of the things that my group works on, in addition to other groups around the country, is how do we learn better representations of the airfoil of something like an airfoil than this. And fundamentally, it comes down to a fairly old problem called something called the Manifold Hypothesis. And the way the Manifold Hypothesis works is I can't plot 100 dimensions for you, but I can plot 3. So let's say we had 3 points that we're determining this airfoil with 3 numbers. The Manifold Hypothesis is actually there's some subspace, often a nonlinear subspace, that actually defines all the meaningful, in this case, airfoil shapes, but again, this could be a material system or system architecture that I would want to explore for any phenomenon that I'm interested in. So for me, that's things like optimization. For other people that I work with, that could be uncertainty quantification, that could be understanding the effect of a certain physics phenomenon. Fundamentally, the idea is that rather than taking my original representation, which is 100-dimensional, my goal is to actually find this little potato chip, as you're seeing here, this subspace that could be quite nonlinear to be able to describe this behavior. Now, people have worked with manifolds before in other contexts. For example, things like quaternions, for example, are mathematical manifold, but those are fixed. Those are not necessarily learned from data. So what I'm talking about here is examples where if you show me examples of airfoils or other types of designs or outputs of a process that I could learn, I could figure out what are these magical 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions, 7 dimensions that actually govern the meaningful behavior of the phenomenon of interest. So this is the kind of work that we work on. And I'm going to talk to you today from the example of the simple 2D airfoil. But what I want you to take away from here is ramifications for this for other types of systems. So we've applied these same ideas to things like power electronics, to aircraft, which is the airfoil example you see here, to energetic material systems that are done on the molecular scale. So the kind of ideas I'm talking here could have general purpose to the areas that you work in, not just the examples that I'm going to show you here. Okay, so a standard way that you might tackle this problem would be to say, okay, well, other people have looked at finding manifolds. Some people have looked at finding linear subspaces, and then folks in computer vision, in the machine learning and data sciences world have recently turned to things like generative models. These are things like generative adversarial networks, normalizing flows, variational autoencoders, basically using a neural network to learn this mapping, though you can use other things as well. But the problem is that if you just take advanced work in computer science and try and directly apply it to engineering problems that have certain kinds of constraints, it usually doesn't go too well. And to show you an example of that, in a paper that we worked on, we just took a standard computer vision model that's worked really well for images and applied it under successive training to generating these airfoils. And as you see, as you increase the amount of training cycles you give this thing, it does generate things that look airfoil-like, but the noise model for how these things generate samples is completely off if my goal is to come up with things that have, say, controlled curvature for things like airfoils, right? And this is a fundamental problem with just kind of taking work in, let's say, machine learning and trying to port it directly to engineering. There's a lot of things we know about physical systems, about engineered systems that we would like to be able to inject into these that can form really strong inductive biases for the machine learning models. So one of my kind of big takeaway points for you today, for those of you watching who work in a specific area of mechanical engineering, is you actually have a lot of value to add to this literature of how can you take things that you know about, invariances that you know about, mathematical structures that you know about, and actually help improve these data science models for your application. In our case, what we did was we took this standard model, and the only modification we basically made was to put a small, what we call a Bezier layer. It's just another layer in one of these neural networks. I'm not going to go into the specific details of it because of the time, but something that could capture things like curvature continuity, curvature control. These are things that matter to people who study aerodynamic shapes. And by sort of marrying our geometric knowledge of the engineering domain with these data science techniques, actually we can come out with things that generate, one, sort of valid curvature continuous shapes, but also learn under much fewer training cycles than the associated computer vision system. So what I mean when I say combining these two is that you're taking examples of your engineering domain knowledge and applying that with the best of what computer science has to offer to actually find a happy medium. And I think there's a bunch of low-hanging fruit here for those of you who work in other mechanical science domains. Okay. Another example where we've done this is for multi-part components. So one of the things that's tricky about engineering systems is it's not just a single image. There might be multiple shapes that need to intersect together. So for example, in this very simplified 2D example, I might have a shape and two conduits that need to pass through each other. Those might have part dependencies depending on how they're manufactured or put together. And it turns out that your engineering knowledge of the overall system architecture, how geometric parts should go together, can actually perform a strong and create a strong inductive bias for these kind of machine learning models. So for example, in this particular case, we actually create separate learned representations for both the outer airfoil as well as all the internal components, and we sort of wire all of the neural architectures together and train them concurrently with some specific tricks that we developed in the paper that I show here. But the sort of high-level result is now what you can do is rather than treating this thing as a giant image to be generated, you can actually learn conditional dependencies that model things like part containment. So for example, the algorithm will learn a representation in which the interior parts are always inside of the exterior parts, even though we didn't tell it explicitly that things like geometric containment were the goal. We didn't tell it geometric relationships that do that. And you'll note even here there's a problem where there's actually a topological hole in the space that this, because we didn't encode the topology correctly in this last layer, it's not able to capture this fact in this model, right? So there's clearly additional work you can do if you know things about the topology of spaces that standard methods can't capture. And to make this even more stark, we looked again with this sort of InfoGAN, which is a concurrent developed computer vision architecture. And what you'll notice here is that it produces nice shapes. These are three shapes that are all inside of one another. And what it does is it learns a space that maps between them, but it's not very interpretable. And I can't pull out independent relationships between each parts. However, if we model these in a hierarchical structure, in this case, we had parts that were internally tangent and externally tangent to the shape. It actually learns without us telling it that a polar coordinates representation is a reasonable representation for parts that have internal tangent constraints. Again, not something that we told it. All we told it was there's some kind of hierarchical relationship here, and it uncovers that polar coordinates is a reasonable representation, even though we didn't tell it anything about tangent constraints. So it's quite powerful to be able to take fairly simple inductive biases from your engineering domain knowledge and encode them as modifications to what would otherwise fail if you just use them out of the box. So that's what design manifolds are. Why are they useful? So they're useful because, well, randomly sampling in this case, this Bézier GAN, but a learned representation space just makes sense. That's the technical term I'm going to use here. And what I mean by that is if I take, again, these minor variants in R latent coordinates, it produces samples that are very similar to samples that you might see in a meaningful airfoil database. In this case, this is the UIUC airfoils database, which is what we've used in our work so far. If you compare this to three modern representations of airfoils, like singular value decomposition, modal coordinates, or freeform deformation, you can see that, again, minor variations in the representation can produce shapes that are self-intersecting or that don't make sense. So this is another indication for why learning these representations is more valuable sometimes than human-crafted representations, which is what you see on the bottom row. It also covers the data distribution better. This is not surprising since it's specifically optimized to do this. But what's interesting about this is that when you do take random samples in human design coordinates like FFD or modal variables, it'll often produce degenerate shapes that they won't even solve. And in this particular case, we're looking at generating samples of different lift and drag. So it covers those samples much better. But those are mostly just parlor tricks. The real benefit to this is when you try and use it for optimization. And so what I'm going to show you now is on the x-axis is basically number of CFD runs. So this could be, a week long if you're doing a really, really expensive large eddy simulation. And this is trying to find optimization, the optimal lift-over drag for a given Mach number or Reynolds number. And if you look at this using traditional representations, you boot up your CAD system right now and try and design one of these things, you see curves that look kind of like this. If it's a NURBS, which is a B-spline, depending on which algorithm optimizer you use, you get this kind of performance. And if you just use something like principal component analysis, which is again this linear subspace, what you can see is that initially it makes faster progress because the number of dimensions it has to optimize is much smaller, and then eventually plateaus because now what happens is all of the good airfoils that you actually want are off manifold. They're off this linear subspace. And so this is kind of the classic phenomenon that you'd expect as you start to decrease dimensions. Once you go nonlinear, however, you can get the same kind of cost reductions in terms of optimization that you would get from a reduced dimension, but still faithfully capture these higher performing airfoils. So in this case, we're able to achieve about a 10x reduction in the amount of CFD runs you have to do to get basically equivalent performance no matter where you go. So this is the sort of punchline for why learned representations are good. They make downstream tasks like uncertainty quantification or optimization much faster. We see the same thing even with state-of-the-art representations. So not stuff from 20 years ago, stuff that was published in the past 2 years, you still see, for freeform deformation, modal variables, SVD, which is a type of principal component analysis, accelerating the optimization, and then again with these nonlinear dimension reductions, achieving even faster performance than those, about 2 to 3x. So this is really the key punchline for why you would care about things like learned representations. Okay, so if I've convinced you that these things are interesting, where can you go from here? One of the questions I always get when we talk about data-driven representations, well, what actual data do I need and how much of it do I need? And what's interesting about the work that I showed you here is that we didn't learn these data-driven manifolds from airfoils that were specifically optimized or that were in any way targeted for the specific Mach number or Reynolds number we were optimizing for. We just used reasonable examples that prior engineers had thought of for different kinds of boundary conditions. But it turns out even those designs that were not optimized for that case still provided a reasonable learned representation that outperformed current state-of-the-art representations like freeform deformation or modal variables. This should not be possible, or at least it didn't make sense to me the first time we saw it. But really, as long as you have some subset of designs that reasonably captures major variations in the space, these learned representations can still be useful. Likewise, if you do have any invariants that you can use to augment it, like we did here with the geometric constraints, those can help. If you are the type of person who doesn't necessarily want to do sort of airfoil synthesis, but you care about things like uncertainty quantification or doing gradient-based optimization using adjoints, you can actually cut and paste various portions of these. So for example, the generator that we use to generate these airfoils is fully differentiable. So it's completely compatible with any kind of uncertainty quantification or adjoint optimization approaches. So you don't necessarily have to pick and choose your approaches. You can combine the best of both worlds. What if innovative examples actually come off the manifold? In other words, they're actually off the subspaces that we learned. Well, it turns out that these are still reasonably good ideas. Learning this manifold is still a reasonably good idea in 2 ways. The first is that you can use this as a base to sort of explore what I would call a cross manifold. So there might be a set of designs that you can use to sort of explore outward and find other designs. So in this particular case, we started with a small set of samples and invented an algorithm that kind of explores around on the manifold to find new and novel designs that you hadn't thought of before. And we had to invent this idea called active expansion sampling to do that, that I'm not going to go into, but if you're interested, you could take a look at our paper on this. And then in addition to exploring across the manifold, you can also explore off manifold. So in this particular case, we can optimize an airfoil until we've achieved the best possible performance we can, and then go back to the 100-dimensional representation where those minor variations around a local, something that's sort of locally optimal in the manifolds could still improve performance. So it's even a good way of warm starting techniques that have nothing to do with finding these low-dimensional learned representations. It can still accelerate that quite significantly. Okay, so off manifold we go, and then you can go and do regular kinds of optimization from there that don't include any of this data-driven manifold work. When shouldn't you use this? Well, if you don't have any reasonable prior designs, like you've never worked in a domain before, then there's not really going to be any prior basis to learn these. And so that's not a place where doing any kind of data-driven modeling would make sense, including the work that I'm talking about here. And likewise, if you can't bootstrap this with simulation, for example, trying a bunch of simulated designs and then down selecting to a subset that work, or known invariants, then this also wouldn't work. So in those two situations, I would recommend doing something like active subspaces or something like this, where you can compute things like gradients. So how could you get started? Well, if you'd like, you can go to our GitHub. All of the examples I've showed here and many others from other papers are available for you to try in your own data, as well as the papers that we have published. But I want to return back to my overall point that I wanted you to take from today, which is that how you represent whatever phenomenon that it is you're studying matters. In my case, it might be airfoil optimization. For other people, it might be uncertainty quantification of a material system. And the way that you mathematically represent that is a non-trivial choice. It could have drastic consequences on how quickly you could do things like optimization, or even if you can do something like uncertainty quantification for your system. And what I've tried to convince you of today is that in addition to thinking through things like group theory or other types of symmetries in the physics of the problem, the mathematics of the problem, that there's advantages to be gained to thinking through how can I leverage past data to help me infer better representations. And I've tried to convince you that this is possible, that it's powerful. It can achieve, in this case, about a 10x reduction in current representations or a 3x reduction in existing state-of-the-art. And also that they're a necessary component if you're going to be able to educate researchers in how to combine the best of what computer science and machine learning and the data sciences have to offer with the best that we have to offer. And so my sort of take-home message, if your goal is to tackle these pressing important societal problems like efficiency and climate change. So my take-home message for you is, if you're a researcher, if you've sort of been reluctant to try some of these data-driven representations, think about ways in which you could combine those with the knowledge that you already have to see if you can create learned representations that might help you with your problem, whether that's in vibrations or thermodynamics. And then, secondly, if you're part of a department or a researcher and you're thinking about a portfolio of skills or capabilities that you can bring together to tackle these problems, having people on your team or students that know these skills is going to give you a strategic advantage, because you'll be able to take the best of what machine learning and the best of what mechanical engineering have to offer. So thank you all for your time today. If you'd like, here are some of the papers that I pulled figures from, and I just want to thank all my students, as well as our various funding sponsors that have made this work possible. And thank you for inviting me here today to talk to you.
Mark, very good. Thank you for a wonderful talk. And as a reminder, we will hold all questions until after Khalid's talk, and we'll engage in several minutes of interesting discussion. So with that, Khalid Jawed joins us from UCLA, where he's currently assistant professor in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering. I believe he's been there for 3 years now. Before that, he was at Carnegie Mellon University as a postdoc. He's working on a number of different areas, some exciting research. I've known Khalid for a number of years now, and we've corresponded quite a bit. And a lot of his robotics work and the computational supplementation that he brings with it, I believe, is very interesting. So we look forward to his talk today, which is entitled "The Discrete Geometric Approach to Simulation of Soft Robots."
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Curt, for the kind introduction. So today I will talk about simulation of soft robots, primarily bioinspired soft robots. And we will try to see how computationally efficient and fast simulation can help us uncover some of the physics behind the robots, as well as the original organism that essentially inspired the design of the robots. So on the left-hand side, I have a bunch of organisms. Some of them are at macro scale, some of them are at micron scale, like bacteria. And inspired by some of these organisms, we will design robots, and we will use novel simulation tools to model these systems and then perform parametric studies to understand the underlying physics behind these systems. And most of this work, well, almost all of this work was done by my students, Wei-Cheng Huang. Shannon Huang is from Carnegie Mellon University, and all the other students except Shannon Huang are from UCLA. Then Yayun Du, she worked on building some of the robots. Jacqueline, Kernish, and Andrew are undergraduate students who also worked on building and fabricating some of the robots. Well, before I begin, we have a postdoctoral position opening. I really want to take the opportunity to advertise the position. And if you need more information, please go to our website, which is simplestructures.computer, and you'll be working at the intersection of mechanics and machine learning. So let's begin. Today, I will first go over fast physics-based simulation tools that are inspired by computer graphics. So simulation tools that can run at interactive rates. And then I will use these simulation tools to learn about the application of deformation and instability in the design of bioinspired robots, as well as the physics of the organisms. So first, I will begin with simulation techniques for soft robots. Then I will go over an example with rolling robot, where we will encounter challenges such as uneven terrain and collision. Then very briefly, I will use the same simulation tool to study two more robots, both of which will include fluid structure interaction. So at the end of the day, I hope that I will have introduced a simulation tool that can simulate large deformation of soft robots and incorporate things like hydrodynamics, collision, and so on. So let's get started with kind of the definition of soft robots. So typically soft robots are made of soft structures. They deform during locomotion. Now here I have a lot of examples of soft robots and grippers. Typically the way these robots are made up are by actuators. So you have a few actuators on the left-hand side, and then we use several of these actuators to build these robots. So for example, this quadruped has 4 of these SMA-based actuators. Now, an overwhelming majority of soft robots can therefore be modeled as a collection of rods, plates, and shells. You can have rigid bodies as well. And this whole system will encounter things like contact actuation and fluid structure interaction. So the framework that I will present today, that is not applicable to every single robot that is out there. However, for the robots that are slender, that looks like a plate or shell or rod, for those types of robots, I hope that the simulation tool will be useful. So let's start from the fundamentals. Let's think of a mass spring system. If I want to simulate a mass spring system in an undergraduate dynamics class, all I have to do is solve this equation that F equals to ma. So mass times acceleration is equal to elastic energy and the external elastic force and the external force. Now the elastic energy that can be obtained from the negative gradient of the elastic energy. And in case of a spring, I'm calling this elastic energy, or I could have called it spring energy as well. It's simply 1/2 kx squared. Now I can use a similar approach, a mass spring based representation, to simulate a robot that looks like an octopus. So let's say this is a representation of the robot. Then the total energy is the sum of stretching and bending energy plus some energy at the head. So stretching energy is just like a spring between two nodes. And I'm not going into the mathematical details of this. The bending energy is related to the turning angle at a node. So if I have 3 nodes here, there is a turning angle. I can calculate curvature binormal from this turn, and then the bending energy is simply 1/2 EI, where EI is the moment of inertia times strength modulus, or bending modulus. So this whole thing is bending modulus times curvature squared. Now at the head, we have to take a spatial. We have to do a spatial treatment. So at the head, the energy at the head is simply the sum of 3 bending energies. So I have 3 angles at the head. So the head energy is simply equal to the sum of 3 discrete bending energies. Now, if I want to, so once I have all the energies, I can just simply solve an equation like this in 2 dimensions. So this is an example in 1 dimension. This is an example in 2 dimension. Now let's move on to 3 dimension. And then instead of calling it a beam, we are going to call it a rod. So for this, we go back to Kirchhoff, who represented the energy as a sum of stretching, bending, and twisting energy. So the main difference between a beam and a rod is this existence of twisting. We will be building up on a simulation tool called discrete elastic rods. And this simulation tool has been used by the computer graphics community since 2010. It has been used in movies like The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and so on. And this was imported to study various systems like calling of rods, bacteria, CNT, and so on to mechanical engineering. So generally speaking, oftentimes in computer graphics, the physical accuracy is neglected. However, in engineering, we cannot really neglect physical accuracy. We have to match experiments and simulations. So in this case, we are careful enough and we have analyzed it enough to make sure that this is actually representing the physical systems. And some of these papers will include comparison with experiments as well. So in case of a 3D rod, instead of the nodes, I will also need the twist. And to measure the twist, I can use the angle between a reference frame, which is the white and black frame here, and the material frame, which is the blue and the red frame here. But in discrete settings, instead of using the continuous rod, I will be using a discrete rod and then formulate a twisting energy at each node by an expression that looks like this. So twisting energy is proportional to Gj, which is the shearing stiffness. Well, G is the shear modulus and J is the polar moment of inertia times the difference between twist angles squared. So this essentially is also like a spring, like a torsional spring. So generally speaking, when we convert a system into a mass spring system, then what happens is we oversimplify the problem. But this is where discrete differential geometry comes in, that it's a method of describing a continuous system through its discrete analog without oversimplification. And sometimes it is called the geometrically exact mass spring representation. So once I have the energy, then I can use like a spring damper system like motion, equations of motion to go forward in time step. So let's apply that. So let's elaborate that through an actual robot. So this robot was built at Carnegie Mellon University, and a paper recently got published. So the reason we use this robot is because the locomotion is in 2D, and therefore it's a good first test to test out our numerical simulations. So it is about a few centimeter in size and fairly light. It is made up of 7 actuators, where n equals to 7. Let's focus on each actuator. I'm not going to go into the details of the actuator because we have several publications on this. Very briefly, this idea is there is an SMA wire embedded in polymeric material, and when the SMA wire is heated, the actuator will change shape. So for example, this is the natural shape of a single actuator, and this is the heated or actuated shape of the actuator. To make it quantitative, let us plot the relative Young's modulus on y-axis as a function of time. So that is the red line here. And electricity is passed through the SMA wire for about 0.1 to 0.3 seconds. And the Young's modulus has been normalized here so that it always starts at 1. So initially it is at 1, then it shoots up to a value of between 2.5 to 3, and then it cools down, and then after about 3 seconds, it goes back to 1 again. Similarly, I'm plotting natural curvature as a function of time. I normalize it so that it always starts at 1, right here. So when electricity is passed through it, it will go down from 1 to about 0.2 and then slowly recover back to 1. And to fit these functions, we used this type of expressions. Now, going forward in the future, we can think about more complicated shapes and using neural networks and data and machine learning techniques to present some of these functions. So I have the Young's modulus, which is varying as a function of time. I have the natural curvature as a function of time. Then we will be implementing that in the simulation. So let's look at the real robot first. This is how it moves around. The robot has not been sped up, so typically soft robots are small, but are slow. But this robot is actually fairly fast. Now, how can we simulate this system? This robot is in 2D, so I can divide up this structure into n nodes. Then I will have 2n degrees of freedom, and for each degree of freedom, I will have an equation of motion, which is simply mass times acceleration is equal to elastic force plus external force plus gravity. And I will discretize this equation and then go forward in time step. And I will not talk about the details of the time stepping. Now, while solving these equations of motion, we solve it using Newton-Raphson's method. And during that method, we need the gradient of these terms. The most critical part is the so-called Hessian of the elastic energy. The elastic force is the gradient of the elastic energy. And if I take another gradient, then I will have to have the Hessian of the elastic energy. Now, this Jacobian matrix is banded. So when we are going forward in time and using Newton-Raphson method, if the Jacobian is banded, then the time complexity of this algorithm is order of n. And that is kind of one of the key parts behind computational speed of this type of algorithms. Now, some of the outstanding challenges, if I want to properly simulate a robot like this, is there is a non-planar surface and friction. So the surface can be non-planar, and we use soft robots so that it can adapt to uneven terrains and it can squeeze through confined spaces and so on. The second one is collision with the surface. So I will talk about how we go about solving those two challenges. So let us rewrite the equation of motion slightly differently. So I'm just simply dividing the left-hand side and right-hand side by the mass of lumped mass at each node mi. Okay, so I have acceleration is equal to 1 over mi times the forces. So if I want to fully constrain a node, I can replace this so-called inverse mass matrix by zeros. What that means is a node with infinite mass that cannot move. So this will fully constrain the node. If let's say I only want to constrain this node that is touching the ground along this vector p, then there's a cool method called the modified mass method from 1998 that says that I can simply use an inverse mass matrix that looks like this. So in addition to that, in addition to constraining it, I will have to account for the reaction forces as well, and that will have to include friction. So there are three rules of contact. There cannot be penetration, so the rod cannot, or the robot cannot fall down. The reaction force always has to be positive. So the ground will always be pushing the robot up. And there, of course, there is a well-known Coulomb's friction law that the ratio of two components of friction forces, or the ratio of two components of the reaction forces will have to be less than mu static, where mu static is the static coefficient of friction. And if it is higher than that, then the robot will begin to slide. So I encourage, if you're interested, you should go back to your paper and read the details. But the idea is that we can arbitrarily non-planar surface, in this case, can be handled. Now let's talk about collision. So let's say I have a robot that is at this position, then we drop it. Then it will bounce back and forth for some time, and then it will slow down. Now, we use the concept of, well, we use damping matrix to recover this type of behavior. However, we are more familiar with the viscous damping, where the damping is simply mass times the velocity times some prefactor. But there is another type of damping that is written by the second, that is represented by the second term here. So this material damping is proportional to the tangent stiffness matrix times velocity. Qualitatively, what this means is this type of damping opposes rapid changes in deformation. So viscous damping will oppose rapid changes in velocity. So that if you're trying to move, it'll stop it. And this one kind of tries to stop rapid changes in deformation. So rapid changes in deformation can happen at the ground, and the amount of damping is a function of the robot material, the type of the surface, and so on. So we use data fitting in this type of setup and come up with a value that the beta is 3e to the power minus 3. So here I'm plotting the y coordinate of the center as a function of time. So initially it is at this height, and then it kind of jumps back and forth, and eventually kind of reaches to 0. Well, not really 0, because 0 is the ground. So it reaches to like a 0.5. So in this method, we can actually also calculate the inelastic collision. So let's put together experiments and simulations and see what happens. So first we will do simulation on a planar surface. So the top is experiments and the bottom is simulations. It's a fairly straightforward case because planar surface. So let's incline the plane with an angle of 3 degrees. It's only 3 degrees, so the motion is very similar to the case of a planar locomotion. Now let's incline it plus 3 degrees. Now what happens if I incline it even further? So then the robot cannot go forward anymore. So now let's make it a sinusoidal point, and the initial location of the robot is at the minimum of the sine wave. So it kind of goes couple steps and then gets stuck. Now let's start from the maximum of the sine wave. Now let's consider another very simple robot, which is the so-called jumper robot. So just a single actuator, and what happens when we let it jump? So the speed is 1/10, right? So the actual robot is actually 10 times faster than this. But of course, the jumper robot, I'm not sure if we can call it a robot because it is fairly simple. So now let's look at the computational time. So I'm plotting the computational time divided by the wall clock time, and I'm plotting that as a function of the time step size in the simulation. So of course, as I keep increasing the time step size, the computation time goes down. And in this entire range, the simulation can accurately represent the experiments. So you can see that when this value is less than 1, that means the simulation is faster than real time. So in our simulation, we used about 100 to 150 nodes. So with that amount of nodes, the simulation can actually beat real time. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to the next part of the talk. So this far, we talked about a simple robot, 2-dimension. It has collision, contact, but everything is in 2D. There was not much influence of the ground, or rather, there was not much influence of the surrounding medium. Yeah, but a key part in soft robotics is the coupling between fluid and the surrounding medium. So to elaborate that, I will talk about a very simple robot, and I will incorporate fluid structure interaction into the system. So I start off with my equations of motion. I have the structure part and the external force, that is the fluid part. So this is highly coupled, because the external force that can depend on the location of the nodes as well as the velocity of the nodes. So we built a simple granular robot for locomotion in sand, or rather granular medium. It has a head in which there is a battery, and then there is a gear motor. The tail The tails are made up of vinyl polysiloxane material, so they're soft elastomeric. And we use a granular medium that is transparent so that we can observe the motion from outside. So to simulate fluid, we use resistive force theory that goes back to 1955, and it has been shown that such theories are oftentimes applicable to granular medium as well. However, RFT was initially developed for low Reynolds fluid, like locomotion of bacteria. So in resistive force theory, it's actually fairly simple, and I won't go into the details. It has a at every segment of the robot has a velocity, and the velocity is divided up in two components: the tangential component and the perpendicular component. And opposing that tangential and perpendicular component are two forces. So along one direction, let's say perpendicular direction, the viscous damping coefficient is eta perpendicular, and along the other direction is eta parallel. RFT says that these two friction coefficients or viscous coefficients are different. So roughly, one is 2 times the other one. And then I can sum up these two forces, and then I will get my total external force. Once we put that in simulation, this is how it looks like. So the robot is moving forward. The tail is rotating along one direction. The head is rotating along the other direction. And the sum of torques, in this case, will become 0. And the total rotation speed is simply the speed of the head plus the speed of the tail. So that is the rating of the motor. Now, if we had a rigid robot, what would happen is there will not be any parallel velocity component, and there will not be any, there will not be any external force along the tangential direction or along the axial direction. So the point is deformation of soft tails, because these tails are deforming, that causes a motion along the axis of this robot. So this is the simulation, this is the experiment that shows this robot. Now, to quantify that, I'll be using two control parameters. One is the speed of the rotation, and the other one is the number of tails. So first I'm plotting the position as a function of time. And of course, it looks linear, so there is a well-defined velocity, and this data is for 2 tails. If we move from 2 tails to 4 tails, where again I plot position as a function of time, looks like there is stick slip. So most likely the resistive force theory doesn't really hold when there are more number of tails. It could be for a variety of reasons, like there's too much hydrodynamic interaction between multiple tails. So we focus on the cases with 2 and 3 tails, and we use one fitting parameter, and then we fit the data, and then I'm plotting the speed as a function of omega. Now, the interesting thing to point out here is we would have guessed that if you increase the number of tails, and tail is sometimes I'll use the term flagellum instead of tail. If you increase the number of tails or flagella, we would expect intuitively that the speed will go up, but in reality, the speed actually goes down. That kind of points to the nonlinearity of this problem, that the red is the case with 2 tails and the blue is the case with 3 tails. I can also plot the efficiency, which is a ratio between the propulsive force divided by the input torque. And again, the 2 tails case is actually performing better in this specific setup. So this is, I would point to this second point here, that as you increase the number of tails, the robot speed decreases. And propulsive efficiency is clearly a nonlinear function of number of tails, the length of the flagellum, its stiffness, and so on. So it's a very highly nonlinear problem, and fast simulation tools can actually help in this case. Now, very briefly, I will, in this example, we ran into this issue that there are like 4 tails or so there could be long-range hydrodynamic interaction, so it doesn't really work well. So an improvement over that is so-called non-local hydrodynamics, where we use slender body theory for simulation. So without going into the details of slender body theory due to Lighthill, the basic idea is this. The velocity on the left-hand side is an integral of the forces along the entire length of this tail. And as such, this formulation can account for the interaction between flows induced by different parts of the flagellum. And that's why it's called a non-local theory. So inspired by bacterium, we developed a simulation tool. So this is the head, and then it has a tail. We have the fluid and the structure and a model of the head using a recent paper, and I won't go into the details of this modeling part. So when omega is small, so when the rotation of this helical flagellum is small, and all of this is in simulation, we haven't built the robot yet. The small, it moves along a straight path. But if omega is large, as you will see, there's excessive hydrodynamic force, and that causes the flagellum to undergo buckling and stability. So then the path becomes nonlinear. So flagellum can buckle due to excessive hydrodynamic force. Now, in this case, we assume low Reynolds number. So this type of robots in future could be, this bacteria-inspired robot could potentially find application at micro scale, such as drug delivery and so on. And the other thing is it only has one control input. Omega is the single control input. Sometimes, depending on omega, it will go straight. Sometimes it will go along a curved direction. Now, the interesting problem is the inverse problem, that if I want the robot to follow a certain path, then what should I go about? How should I go about that? To do that, let's quantify the motion again. So I'm plotting the length ratio. So let's say the length is we define the length as the distance between the head and the tip of the tail. And I normalize that by the initial length. And I plot that as a function of angular velocity. So before a threshold angular velocity omega b, this length ratio is close to 1, so the shape is helical, and then it gets buckled and it takes a highly deformed shape. So there is a critical buckling velocity above which buckling will happen. So we use this idea and we use some data-driven techniques. You can use simple neural networks, and I will show citation of our paper later on. And you can use that to essentially come up with the control signal omega as a function of time so that the robot will follow a prescribed trajectory. So on the left-hand side, the robot is moving along a square trajectory in 3 dimensions. So it's a planar square trajectory. And then it is moving along a triangular trajectory. So with that, I'm almost, before I end, I'll thank all the students who worked on this project, as well as are currently working on this in our lab. In conclusion, I introduced physics-based simulation tools that can generate data. And once we have the data, once we have this physics-based data, our future goal is to more extensively employ techniques from machine learning algorithm to do things such as designing the control system so that a robot can follow a prescribed trajectory, as well as there are a lot of opportunities in design and optimization of this type of these types of robots as well. We're typically open to sharing our source codes as well, and we plan on releasing our source codes publicly for soft robot simulation by the end of this year. We use the simulation tools to get insight into the application of deformation and stability in robots. However, some of these observations can potentially be applicable to the actual biological systems as well. So nature might have already optimized itself to exploit deformation and stability, especially in case of bacteria. With that, I'd like to thank UCLA for the start of funding and National Science Foundation for supporting part of the work. And I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present my work here. Thank you.
Khalid, thank you for a wonderful talk. So with that, we appreciate the time and effort both of our speakers have given to our forum here today. And I also invite you to check your notes and assemble your questions. And let's get started. Does anybody have any questions for either Mark or Khalid? So I will begin, if not. And Mark, you talked about physical constraints based upon engineering knowledge. Can you describe a little bit how one manifests that in the machine learning context?
Sure. So, I mean, I've primarily looked at things like geometric constraints, but actually, I mean, some of the work that Khalid has done has, there's another example where you have physical constraints as well. So there's a couple of different ways that people can encode these things. So the first, and the way that I've typically approached it, is directly into something about the architecture of, let's say, it's a neural network itself. So in the work that I presented, what we did is we basically took the way that people typically would represent these networks, and we said, okay, there are some additional constraints that we're going to put in such that by construction, anything that this thing outputs is naturally going to live on, let's say, a Bezier surface or a set of Bezier curves. So that's where you build in some kind of invariance directly into something like the output of the model. That's like a hard constraint. There would also be a soft constraint, which would be something like a regularization term. So those people who have heard of things like physics-informed neural networks as a term, that's an approach a lot of them will use as well. They'll say, you have this general class of functions that these machine learning models can output. We're going to impose either through Lagrange multipliers or other types of softer constraints, a forcing function that forces the models to those, to something like the solution to a set of PDEs, for example. So those are the primary ones that that I've looked at.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. So let's see. So Bettina has a question. Would you like to ask your question, Bettina?
Sure. So thank you both for your presentations. I was just wondering, as a grad student in mechanical engineering myself, as engineers look more at working in the areas at the intersection of mechanical engineering and sort of machine learning and artificial intelligence, are there any common pitfalls that you've seen or warnings that you'd have for us?
I can talk, unless Khalid, would you like to say something? Otherwise, I can talk about it.
It's a controversial topic. I mean, okay, I can start, and feel free to share your own thoughts as well.
So I encourage you to be controversial.
Yeah. So I feel like machine learning, the history of that goes to getting detecting images and looking at data from Google and Facebook, and looking at unphysical, not so physics-based data. There's not much structure, I think, well-defined structure in this type of data. Now, when we want to use machine learning on physics-based data, I think it already has a certain structure to it, and there is very little noise to it. And we want to use physics, in my opinion, as much as possible, and then want to go into machine learning to model some of these systems, and then incorporate these models into more complex numerical simulation frameworks. So I think it is kind of important to understand the fundamentals of, let's say, a neural network, what type of activation function you're going to use, and so on, without taking that as a black box. I think oftentimes we take that certain things as a black box, and do not have a very good understanding, and therefore we kind of fail to apply that properly. Simple example is, all of you know of ReLU activation function, like ReLU. Now that one has an undefined derivative at 0, right? So in our simulation, we need the derivative, or any Newton-Raphson type method. If you're trying to solve an equation, you need to, if you want to include that in an Euler backward approach, you need the derivative as well. So if your derivative is undefined at certain point, you're going to get in trouble. So my broad opinion is it is important to know the fundamentals behind some of these algorithms before using it.
Mark, would you like to comment?
Sure. Yeah, I'm actually somewhat intimately familiar with this question. So I was hired into the department about 5 years ago, in part to actually create a course that was machine learning for engineers that was targeted at both senior level undergraduates and graduate students. And I've spent basically the past 5 years wrestling with this exact question, including this semester. So I think there are a couple of common, you asked about pitfalls. I think one of the challenges in this area is that engineers have a lot of expertise in various areas of science and mathematics. So things like calculus, for example. There are certain, and those are super useful for things like understanding machine learning. However, there's a variety of techniques that we don't do as good a job of educating our undergraduates on that then become later prevent people from getting footholds into machine learning, depending on the department, obviously. So for example, things like linear algebra and very advanced stochastic processes are not things that you would typically learn at an undergraduate level. And those are things that play up all the times, whether you're doing probabilistic graphical models, neural network, kernel machines, all of these things. There's even things like convex analysis and real analysis that physicists would do, but not necessarily mechanical engineers. And so that presents a really steep learning curve for students who want to go and take a course in, let's say, the computer science department or the statistics course. That being said, I think a lot of sort of on the other side, there's an opportunity that people fall into and they think, oh, I can't, as an engineer, I'm just going to learn what they do and apply it to what I do. And that's actually, I think engineers have a lot more to give to that community than we give ourselves credit to. For example, the thing that just won the NeurIPS, which is one of these big ML conferences, best papers about a year or two ago now, was basically treating a neural network as an ODE. Well, we know something about ODEs, right? And it turns out that that actually spawned a whole new work of this area in machine learning called normalizing flows, which is treating these classifiers as essentially flow type problems. So all of these solutions to these time-dependent PDEs that we know lots about, they're basically having to reinvent or learn for the first time. So I think another pitfall is that students come in and they don't bring their existing knowledge of heat transfer and dynamics to the table, and we're actually missing opportunities there to create impacts both on our sides as well as to invent just new ways of looking at the problem. So that's kind of a negative pitfall and a positive pitfall for you in the short time that we have here. Hopefully that helped answer the question.
How did they do, Bettina?
Great job. Thank you so much.
Excellent. You're given both an A. All right, so one additional question that I have is, we've been doing physics computing for a very long time, and we have a lot of history experience, especially in mechanics, mechanical engineering, and related fields. How can these data-rich techniques now begin to use high-performance computing information? And in particular, a lot of the computer architectures now are being designed differently, say half precision, for example, in a way that we simply cannot use for physics computing. How can we do both? Khalid, why don't you take that one first? I've known you the longest.
Yeah, to be honest, I think it's it'll be challenging, right? Like doing both, or should we? So should the hardware be specific to the application, or rather, the hardware should be able to do both? Is that kind of the gist of the question, or?
So the gist of my question. So I have a comment first, and I'm saying we should do both. And so I'm asking both of you, how can we do that? Khalid.
So I have to. It's a difficult. I think it's a very difficult example.
Sure, no, I know, but we're trying to gain from your experience. What are your insights on these stuff? These are big problems, but let's talk about it.
let's talk. I mean, I'll just I guess mention like a wild idea that has to do with computation using the soft mechanics itself.
Mm-hmm.
That like people and there are some advanced projects where people are looking at using mechanics of soft structures as a computer, soft robot computer.
Mm-hmm.
And when these are and there has been a recent at least one recent paper, and I think if you just Google soft robot computer or something, like you will figure that out. So here, the kind of the part of the computing is embedded into the structure itself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we can think of the structure as part of the computer as well. And sometimes we call it, we can call it a material integrated control as well, where part of the computation is delegated to the material. And an example is, let's say I have a robot with 4 legs, and 2 of the legs will always actuate together, and the other 2 legs will always actuate together. So there is a coupling between the actuation scheme. And in that case, I think eventually we can use both the hardware and the soft material in computation. But on a more, but these are, that is probably a wild idea, but more tangible and likely and I guess more easier approaches has to do with things like transfer learning and data reduction. That let's say I want to have computation, and the robot will have a microchip, and the microchip will do all the computation.
Mm-hmm.
Now that chip most likely is not going to be powerful enough to run like a simulation with 1,000 nodes.
Mm-hmm.
But if we simulate a model in a off board, and then use transfer learning to train like a simpler neural network, and then embed that into the actual robot itself, that could, I think, go a long way in achieving autonomy of these robots. And then the vision will be, let's say the robot has a model, a reduced model of itself in its brain, and the brain is the small microchip. Then it should be able to figure out, let's say, if one of its legs stops working, it should be able to tell, okay, this leg has stopped working, and so I should adapt my control law based on the model that I already have. And yes, I think embedding, like reducing the models and then trying to embed some of the computation in the longer run, some of the computation in the material itself could have some promising directions.
Okay. Mark, would you like to comment?
I'll just maybe one comment on both directions. So I think you asked basically, if I'm understanding correctly, you have all of this great work that's been done in high performance computing for physical systems. What of that can be leveraged to make improvements on the ML side? And likewise, or maybe is there a crosstalk that would happen the other way? Definitely, right? So certainly for things like a lot of these, whether it's neural, it doesn't have to be neural networks. It could be something like a Gaussian process. A lot of these fundamental operations that people use in machine learning are things like Hessian vector products, or special Jacobian vector things that are very common to scientific computing that have specialized structures. And so now what you're seeing is ML engine, people who study these things will say, well, we're trying to solve this general class of problem, but what happens if my neural operator code that I want to do has this banded structure? Well, hey, guess who's solved that problem, or who's really studied that problem? People in scientific computing. So I think there's an amazing amount of speed ups that people in that community have been able to leverage quite effectively to achieve, which we in the scientific computing and physics community have studied for decades. And likewise, actually going back to Khalid's point, right? Some of these, another way that it would go is when you think of things like how to do morphological computing, as he was mentioning, people in the ML world will think through things like, I have this general class of functions, let's say it's a normalizing flow or some other fancy modern technique. How can I inject different kinds of constraints onto those flows to be able to produce certain probability distributions? Well, if somebody like Khalid comes along and says, well, hey, here's a system of equations that governs how information propagates through this material system, that acts as a natural regularizer that these people are already studying. So I actually don't think his idea is wild at all. I think it's actually quite reasonable. And it's a good example of the merger between those two.
So what about sparsity of data in data sets for machine learning? Could one merge empirical data sets with computed data sets in a way that alleviate that issue, potentially saving a lot of money, or maybe being able to go to state spaces where we simply don't have any empirical information and it's unavailable?
I think that's very reasonable too. Oh, sorry, Khalid, go ahead. If you wanted to talk about that.
Sure, yeah, very briefly. Yeah, I think that is really the crux of a lot of the things that we should be working on in this area of physics and machine learning based community, that we have the data should have an internal structure to it. And so even if the data is sparse, we should be able to get a lot of information. So for example, let's say if I know that my force should be directly proportional to the velocity, then I need a single data point to actually calibrate the curve of force versus velocity, right? So I think there's a lot of opportunities there.
Okay. Good.
I'd say something similar, And there's some really interesting work on things like what they call Hamiltonian neural networks or Lagrangian neural networks. So basically, it's exactly the same architecture. They didn't muck anything there, but all they did was they took sort of differentiable adjoint simulations from the physics system, and now they're able to train the system not only to produce the forward motion, but also all the derivatives of the Hamiltonian to do things like conservation of energy. So that's almost like a freebie, right? I didn't have to add any additional data, no additional computation, but with additional knowledge of the physics, I'm able to make that work better for me. So I think that's the next 5 to 10 years, I can imagine a lot of interesting work coming out in that area.
Yeah, very good. So Partha has a question.
Hello, everyone. So first of all, great talks to both of you. Thank you. First of all, that's very important. I wanted to say that. Probably this question is more to Khalid, but for general discussion, I think when you included the effect of the granular media, and certainly you had to add more constraints to your model or more additional physics to include that as well. So in your experience in this tuning or adding this extra physics or force field, if you may call it, what kind of complexities you encountered, especially when to get this model trained, or even bringing the physics-based interpretation of the data and also the computation time? Maybe some discussions or comments would be very helpful, because I think we are all talking about data-driven modeling. So it's more of a general question for discussion. So thank you.
So I'll try to address that first. So we first come up with a few performance metrics of the robot, and it could be velocity, it could be efficiency, it could be how fast the head is rotating, and so on. And then in this case, we only had one fitting parameter. So I had to run, we had to run hundreds of simulations at different values of that fitting parameter, which in this case was the viscosity of the granular medium, how viscous that granular medium is. And we just figured out what value of viscosity is best fitting the one of the performance parameters. And then we try to check whether this fitted parameter can accurately reproduce in simulations all the other performance parameters, like things like efficiency, or can it accurately reproduce if I change the number of legs and so on. So it can actually do that. Now, however, in pretty much all the examples that we have worked so far had to do with 1 to maximum of 3 fitting parameters. And so we could kind of take like a brute force approach to it. Now, if we want to go even farther, and let's, instead of fitting a single scalar, we want to fit like a function. Right? So, let's say I want to observe an elastoplastic rod deformation and come up with what is the constitutive behavior of it just by looking at the macroscopic data. I think that will be very challenging, and I think that is where some of the tools from machine learning could be useful. There has been some work that I have not done it, none of that myself, but that I have seen in using things like genetic algorithm to optimize neural network design and so on for faster training. And I think those advanced tools from machine learning community could be very useful in this case.
Thank you. And probably I think that kind of is segue to Mark's first part about this airfoil or aerofoil design and even different things. I was just thinking that even a slight change, even for a, let's say, well-studied framework, well-studied shape or something, or even design, there are so many different variabilities that could come in or how that can be improved. So I was thinking that way, and there's a reason behind it. When some of this work that I do, when I think about it, we do a lot of flow or transport through porous materials, and then you add a lot of complexities to the additional features or constraints. So it's kind of to both of you, even a slight change, although you know that this particular structure is very well studied, we know how it affects the performance metrics, but even you know that the performance metrics is defined, but what feature is so sensitive, and even the knowledge about it becomes very difficult. That's sort of my question. So maybe I'll leave it to Mark to make a comment on that. So because it was very interesting, what you showed at the beginning about the airfoil example. So.
Yeah, I think the fundamental kind of hypothesis, right, in this is this idea of learning a representation. Now, why is that useful at all? Well, it's because the world is kind of over parameterized, and either nature, due to a variety of physical interactions, or humans, because of the way we go about designing things or our intuition, have basically this little pancake of space where we seem to be operating. And when we do something like a genetic algorithm or others, it kind of moves us away from that pancake and the world kind of collapses around us, right? And the trick is, what is that magical space? And mathematicians have worked for a long time on finding things like invariant spaces that very compactly describe those. And that's great in those situations where those works. But for something like an airfoil or a soft robot or a very porous material flow system, it's not obvious. If I can think very carefully about what it is, I could write down, that'd be great. But it's often not obvious. But when we look at examples of nature, whether it's bioinspired or solutions to sort of PDEs, you could kind of look at various points along an optimization of a set of equations to determine this ridge structure. Those are often areas where you can generate these kind of samples. So this is actually what we're doing for the Department of Energy right now, is doing this for turbine designs, as well as compressor blades and power electronics circuits. So it occurs everywhere. All sorts of systems have these like unique little like ridges where all of the good stuff is. And if only you could find that good ridge, you could explore along it, and the world's your oyster. And that's the key problem, both for optimization, which is what I care about, but even just understanding, what's the effect of this transport process on XYZ. If only I could just do all of my experiments along this magical little ridge, then I could learn so much more. And the problem is we don't know what that is.
That's fantastic. I think this discussion is very helpful. So great. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Okay, does anybody else have any questions or comments for our two speakers? Okay, if not, we thank Mark and Khalid again for their fine presentations. We wish them both the best in their careers, and we look forward to reading your papers in the future and becoming colleagues as well.
Thank you so much for the invitation to come here. This was so much fun.
Same here. Thank you so much.
Thank you both.